Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Microstress Effect, How Little Things Pile Up and Create Big Problems, and What to Do About It, by Cross and Karen Dillon. Narrated by Chloe Cannon. Publisher's note: this audiobook has bonus material. Please contact whomever you purchased this audiobook from to request the material. All figures and tables referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. Introduction. Invisible and Relentless. We didn't set out to write this book. For the past 2 decades, I, Rob Cross, have been studying the underlying network dynamics of effective organizations and the collaborative practices of high performers. I've written extensively about how certain people can work far more productively than others because of how they tap their network of connections. I've tried to identify the flawed assumptions that are often baked into the corporate understanding of who their most valuable employees are and how these people leverage networks to produce results. But in doing a series of interviews with high achievers about the practices that allow them to be effective collaborators, I stumbled onto something bigger. In one of my first interviews, I heard a wonderful story about the role that connections with others played in helping a life sciences executive shift to a healthier lifestyle after a stern warning from her doctor. She went from being a self-described sedentary workaholic to a person who actively chose vacation destinations where she and her husband could run marathons together. When we spoke, her energy was off the charts, and she was clearly in a great place in her life. Because my interviews were focused on people who had been identified as high performers by their organizations, it made sense that I'd speak with a marathon runner or two. But as she was enthusiastically sharing her new lifestyle with me, I wondered something different. How had someone who was clearly goal-driven neglected her own well-being so drastically? On a whim, I asked her what had thrown her so off track in the first place. For a moment, she was stumped. "It was just life, I guess," she told me. So we made a point of asking similar questions of the other high performers, 300 in total, split across women and men, that we interviewed. Many of them were powder kegs of stress, but most of them didn't recognize the state they were in. We would be deep into our interview before they began to acknowledge that they were struggling to keep up with both work and their personal lives. And these people had been identified by their organizations as exceptionally effective performers. During our interviews, many choked up or even broke down into tears, lamenting that they couldn't see a path out of feeling like they were barely holding it all together. After decades of research, I was familiar with the kind of recognizable stress that high performers often endure to achieve their professional goals. But this was something completely different. It was stress, but in a form that neither they nor we had the language to articulate. What became clear as we talked is that it was never one big thing that led people to feel overwhelmed. Rather, the relentless accumulation of unnoticed small stresses and passing moments is what was drastically affecting the well-being of these people who otherwise appeared to have it all. We call these small pressures microstress. Ample data tells us that people across the world are under unprecedented levels of stress. For example, in its annual State of the Workplace survey, Gallup concluded that only 33% of those surveyed were thriving, with 44% of employees reporting experiencing a lot of stress in a typical workday, a record high. But little recognized or adequately studied is the toll of this new form of stress. The toll is so subtle that we barely register it, but the cumulative effect can derail even high performers both personally and professionally. Where is all this microstress coming from? We all accept that we now live in a hyper-connected 24/7 world, with everyone a simple text, call, or video chat away. In every realm of our lives, we have to be on call to people in both our personal and our professional lives around the clock. But what high performers and other smart people like you, the listener, fail to recognize is how these connections trigger an avalanche of microstress that extends far beyond a lengthy to-do list or full calendar. Because microstress comes from the people we are closest to, personally and professionally, there are layers of emotional complications too. We can't simply shake it off at the end of the day. Microstress seeps into our thoughts, saps our energy, and diverts our focus. Little by little, it's stealing our lives. As the heartbreaking stories of many people's lives unfolded in our interviews, I decided to pivot my own work to address this unrecognized epidemic of microstress. As I listened to the high performers discuss the small stresses that had somehow snowballed into pressure affecting their personal well-being, I realized that I, too, was not immune from microstress. Like many of you, I am prone to saying yes to too many projects and requests, assuming I can put my head down and get through any rough patches with a bit of willpower. I had been telling myself I could survive if I could just get through this 1 week. Except every week became that 1 week. I maintained that philosophy for months on end without a break, and what I hadn't recognized until then was the enduring ripple effects of microstress. I was in the worst shape of my life, and it had been far too long since I'd been truly present with some of the most important people in my life. For personal and professional reasons, I needed to make sense of this phenomenon. With this sense of urgency in mind, I reached out to Karen Dillon, a former editor of Harvard Business Review and co-author of the New York Times bestseller, How Will You Measure Your Life?, to ask if she would collaborate with me on this new work. I'd long been a fan of Karen's work with Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. The work has focused on helping people understand how to live lives of purpose. After being on a fast-track career trajectory herself, she had made some important life changes that allowed her to reframe her own priorities. She had taken the extraordinary step of resigning from her position as editor of Harvard Business Review at the peak of her career to refocus her life on her family for a few years. Only after she brought her life back in balance did she begin to fully resume her professional activities. We talked for months about my research before we decided that we not only wanted to write this book, but also needed to write it to help other people understand what was happening to them. Working together during the pandemic made this goal even clearer to both of us. There is far too much at stake in your physical and mental health to allow microstress to ruin your life. And as we wrote this book, both of us made a conscious effort to employ some of the tactics we learned in our research to mitigate our own microstress. We'd catch ourselves falling into old habits, sometimes pausing our meetings to remind ourselves how to avoid unintentionally triggering waves of microstress for the other. Or we'd make a point of spending a few minutes on every call connecting personally, even if we were pressed for time. And throughout this process, both of us worked hard to stay connected with our friends and family outside of work in ways designed to combat and even preempt the toll of the microstress that we too must deal with. 2 years after we began this project, we have gotten our own microstress under better control. How this book can help. In the chapters that follow, we'll share the insights we gained from hundreds of interviews and from Rob's long-term work on collaboration. Through our research, we have found that you can structure your life in ways that not only help diminish microstress, but also improve your overall well-being. This approach will involve, in fact, require, building and strengthening authentic connections with others. These connections will, in turn, add dimensionality to your life and help you mitigate the effects of microstress. It's a virtuous cycle. In Chapter 1, we will define microstress, illustrating what it is and how it's quietly ruining your life. Other chapters will help you identify the sources of microstress in your life so that you can diagnose where your problem spots lie and craft strategies for pushing back. Chapter 2 identifies microstresses that drain your capacity to get things done. Capacity-depleting microstresses leave many of us feeling as if we're failing, both at work and in our personal lives. We can barely get through the responsibilities of our day. This chapter offers practical suggestions for pushing back or restructuring some of your interactions to minimize the impact of this form of microstress. In Chapter 3, we'll focus on microstresses that deplete your emotional reserves, the internal pool of peace, fortitude, and resilience that helps you focus, prioritize, and manage fear, anger, anxiety, and concern for those you care about. We'll examine where emotionally draining microstresses are coming from and offer guidance on how to prevent them from eating away at your everyday quality of life. In Chapter 4, we'll discuss microstresses that challenge your identity and that trigger the uncomfortable feeling that somehow you're not quite the person you really want to be. These microstresses slowly chip away at your motivation and sense of purpose. This chapter will help you see where these microstresses are affecting your life and offer actionable tips for getting back on course. Chapter 5 describes how to develop a comprehensive plan for addressing both the primary and the secondary effects of microstresses. A series of exercises helps you craft a realistic plan for getting the microstresses in your own life under control. The best practices laid out for you here come from the people we call 10%ers, the 1 out of 10 interviewees who successfully navigate their microstress while maintaining full and satisfying personal and professional lives. Fortunately, you can incorporate some of the best practices of these 10%ers into your own life, with a little work. Chapter 6 discusses how people are conditioned to think that resilience is something they have to dig deep to find inside themselves. We'll show, instead, how connections with others provide 7 predictable forms of resilience that help you navigate difficult stretches, if you have built the relationships and know how and when to tap into them. In Chapter 7, we will debunk the conventional wisdom that maintaining people's physical health is a solitary activity that relies on willpower. We ask a tough question. If staying healthy is as simple as knowing what to do and being motivated to take action, then why do so many of us fail in our New Year's Eve resolutions just a few weeks in? Because health is intimately intertwined with the people in your networks. We'll demonstrate how connections with others play a critical role in maintaining or resurrecting your physical health, far beyond simply having workout buddies. Finally, in Chapter 8, we'll explore the power of finding purpose, specifically the power of finding purpose in everyday interactions to help you navigate the daily onslaught of microstresses. The 10%ers in our research were not defined by magnificent undertakings, but flourished instead by living small moments more richly with others. Chapter 8 shows you how to find purpose in your own life, not in 6 months or next year, but tomorrow. We recognize that asking someone whose life is brimming with microstress to take the time to listen to a book about their problems might seem counterproductive, but we promise you the payoff will be real. As we explore the concept of microstress in this book, we hope that you can better articulate something you've already been feeling, and then we can help you make changes. In our research, we have seen that even just pushing back on 2 or 3 microstresses can make a significant difference in your day-to-day life. Every chapter has coaching breaks and specific practices you can adopt. We have also written this book so that once you understand the concept of microstress, you can focus on the parts that will have the biggest impact on your life. Microstress is a solvable problem. You have never had more ability to control what you do and with whom you do it. As one interviewee put it, "I just want to reclaim my life." You can do exactly that. In the chapters that follow, we will show you how. Chapter 1: A Crisis of Well-Being. Microstress, tiny moments of stress triggered by people in our personal and professional lives, stresses so routine that we barely register them, but whose cumulative toll is debilitating. Key insights. We can't escape microstress, because the people who are unwittingly causing it are embedded in our personal and professional lives. Microstress comes at us quickly and in small moments. It doesn't set off the typical fight-or-flight vigilance systems that help us survive other more noticeable forms of stress. Our bodies experience the cumulative impact of the microstress, but the cause of that stress remains invisible to us. Microstresses can set off a chain reaction of primary, secondary, and sometimes tertiary consequences that can last for hours or even days, though you may not connect the effects to the original microstress. You can mitigate the impact of microstress. You can't eliminate microstress, unless you want to move to a desert island or become a recluse, but you can learn strategies for reducing its volume, depth, and negative effects, and for making your connections with people in your personal and professional networks integral to your well-being. Something was wrong. Was it chest pain? He couldn't quite tell. The feeling was fleeting, as Brian later told us, but I was convinced I had a heart problem. In a panic, he headed to the emergency room. As a managing director at one of the world's most well-respected investment banks, Brian had prided himself on his intense devotion to staying fit. He was a committed Peloton cyclist. He could tell you his average heart rate, speed, resistance, and power output on any given day. Having recently lost his mentor to a cardiac event, Brian was hyper-aware that the feeling in his chest was not normal for a healthy 38-year-old. When a battery of tests turned up nothing, Brian assumed the pressure in his chest was all in his imagination. To be honest, I kind of wigged out there for a little bit, he told us. We met Brian because he had been identified by his company as a high performer. When we first started talking, we understood why his company had suggested him for our research. Brian seemed to have it all. He had a happy and healthy family, he lived in a tony suburb of a major city, and he was on his way professionally to achieving more than he'd ever imagined possible for a kid from a working-class background. He was the personification of cool confidence. But as we asked Brian to walk us through a typical day in his life, a different pattern emerged. I feel like I'm failing at everything, he confessed, both at work and in my personal life. Nobody is getting enough of me. As we talked about why he was feeling that way, we were not surprised to hear that Brian had pushed himself to the point of a panic attack. He had become so used to the daily microstresses in his life that he just plowed through them one by one, without recognizing that the cumulative effect of those brief moments lingered beyond the original trigger. For example, Brian couldn't remember the last time he had enjoyed a good night's sleep. I just can't shut off my mind at night, he told us. But it's nothing major. It's just a bunch of small things. He listed the things that were already rattling around in his brain that day. He thought he was sharing his to-do list with us, but we heard a list of microstresses. He woke up thinking about how 2 of his colleagues had not yet finished an analysis he needed for a presentation to other managing directors in 2 days. He started worrying about the work he would have to do to make up for their shortcoming. Because his company spanned time zones around the world, he seldom started his day without waking up to a flood of emails sent overnight and bearing troubling news about the financial markets or happenings somewhere else in the company. His boss was notorious for sending demanding late-night emails that changed what he had been asking Brian to work on. Key clients often sent similar late-night emails. His boss and clients seldom acknowledged that their demands represented a change from their original requests. But these shifts not only impacted Brian, but also affected all the people he was coordinating with to get the work done. And that was just the start of his day. Throughout his workday, he was bombarded with microstresses. The day we spoke to him, he told us how he was gearing up to fight for bonuses for his team. Last year, He had lost an internal political battle with another department head for some of the discretionary bonus pool. He was still getting to know his current team because senior leaders in the company kept rotating star players off his work groups to respond to pressing needs in other parts of the company. He didn't want to let his team down this year. As we were finishing our interview, Brian was rushing off to sit down with a senior leader who was increasing pressure on him to raise the firm's profile in capital markets, but who didn't seem to understand some of the fundamental challenges of Brian's business unit. During the brief window of our interview, we could hear his phone and laptop pinging with messages and alerts. Between email, Slack, and video calls, I'm never off the clock, he told us. But I have no right to complain. I am financially secure and have a wonderful, supportive spouse and a home that is nicer than I ever thought I would have, and my kids seem to be thriving. What do I have to complain about? Microstress isn't just shorthand for having a long to-do list. It's also emotional baggage that's not easy to resolve. The source of microstress is seldom a classic antagonist, such as a spectacularly demanding client or jerk boss. Rather, it comes from the people with whom we are closest, our friends, family, and colleagues. When we first talked, Brian didn't even think to mention a host of other microstresses that were part of his daily personal life, such as his concern for his 85-year-old father, who had told him that he was experimenting with the dosages of his medication to see how he felt. His dad consequently sometimes forgot to take his medication altogether, often sleeping through much of the day as a result. With too much daytime sleep, his father couldn't sleep at night and was falling more frequently as he padded around his home in the dark. So Brian and his wife took turns dropping by his parents' house to check in on them. But this routine was getting harder to do because work was so consuming. Brian's wife had a demanding job too, and she was up for partnership this year. They probably needed to hire a caregiver. But when would they find the time to do that? And would his parents be receptive to it? How would that conversation go? As Brian's situation demonstrated, emotional baggage is the guilt we harbor, the sense that we've let down a loved one, or the concern we feel for their well-being. The emotion in the relationship, positive or negative, magnifies the impact of the stressor. Microstresses may be tiny, but they're complicated. Table 1-1, which can be found in the accompanying bonus PDF, details how microstress differs from the routine stresses we've come to accept as part of our lives. Table 1-2 summarizes the 14 common microstresses according to 3 categories that are the focus of this book. In later chapters, we will explain each of these microstresses in depth. We suspect that as you scanned the list, you could immediately tick off at least a few microstresses that you're dealing with. By our count, Brian was experiencing almost all 14 microstresses, and that was just on one particular day. Though there might be variations on the same themes, many of us would probably describe our daily lives in similar ways. And, like Brian, you might assume that you just have to accept microstresses as the way things are. Each of these individual moments in the microstress column may seem manageable. After all, they are mere moments. But we often fail to see how microstresses set off a chain reaction of primary, secondary, and sometimes even tertiary consequences that can last for hours or days, invading your life in ways that you don't connect to the original stress. Microstresses can cause a myriad of problems, including these. They deplete your time. When you have to invest too much time working toward and resolving an issue, you cut into the time you need for other work obligations. This loss of time creates stress as you worry about your commitments to others, how you will find the time to do that work, and what colleagues' reactions will be if you give short shrift to something or miss a deadline. Microstresses derail you from your own goals. Being pulled in different directions keeps you in a reactive mode, where you're less able to shape your own work efforts toward things that you personally care about. As a result, You are always busy, but are unable to do the things that matter for your own long-term career success and sense of purpose. They make you sacrifice your personal commitments. The scramble to get work done can cause you to shirk or shortchange personal commitments to family, friends, and other groups to which you belong. Who hasn't dreaded delivering the news that you can't keep a commitment to a loved one? And it's not just the ever-present guilt of missing a child's soccer game or school play. It's also a product of slowly removing activities and relationships outside of your immediate family from your priority list. Making your life smaller to cope with the endless stream of microstress can wreak havoc on your physical and mental health. They drag loved ones into your work stress. When you are forced to back out of your commitments because of microstresses that tax you at work, you add microstress to your relationships outside work. Or you share your microstress with your loved ones, relaying your version of an injustice that you've had to endure. As supportive spouses and friends tend to do, they empathize and share your outrage. Their feedback feels good for a moment, but in reality it can loop back on you, magnifying the initial impact of the microstress. You're right. They are taking advantage of me. You spiral further into the microstress, and now your loved ones are emotionally involved too. Microstresses damage relationships in your network. Many of us resort to calling in personal favors when we're enduring microstress. Perhaps you enlisted a teammate to stay late to conduct an analysis or draft a section of your slide deck for an upcoming presentation. Or you asked a colleague to call in a favor with a vendor. But a sudden shift in expectations from a client or leader changed what you need to get done, making the favor and the stress it caused pointless. If I would have known that you weren't going to need that data Monday morning, I wouldn't have worked over the weekend. And of course, you're never coping with just one or two microstresses. Like Brian, you're likely to be facing dozens in a given day, and they pile on, week after week and month after month. So you're exhausted and burned out, but you can't quite put your finger on why. There's a reason for that. How our brains respond to microstress. Microstress is particularly pernicious because it is baked into our everyday lives at a volume, intensity, and pace we have never experienced, and yet our bodies don't quite know what to make of it. The process by which our body normally responds to stresses is called allostasis, the biologic mechanisms that protect the body from internal and external stress and help maintain internal homeostasis, or internal balance. Our brains know how to register conventional forms of stress. We identify the threat and use the extra oomph of the fight-or-flight mechanisms that kick in to deal with threats. Unfortunately, microstresses fly under the radar of these typical vigilance systems, while still taking a significant toll. Joel Salinas, a behavioral neurologist and researcher at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine and chief medical officer at Isaac Health, which provides online brain health services, explained. "Imagine wind eroding a mountain," said Salinas, whose research focuses on the impact of psychosocial factors on brain health. "It's not the same as a big TNT explosion that punches a hole in a mountain. But over time, if the wind never stops, it has the potential to slowly wear an entire mountain down to a nub." We may not be consciously aware of microstresses, but they can increase our blood pressure and our heart rate, as happened during Brian's panic attack, or trigger hormonal or metabolic changes. So while microstresses are damaging our bodies, our brains are not registering them fully as a threat, Salinas says, and therefore our brains are not triggering the same kind of protective, higher-order mechanisms that might occur in the face of more obvious stress. The brain fails to recognize microstress, partly because of how it processes information. The working memory part of the brain occupies the frontal lobe. Our working memory is where we keep mental notes, a kind of mental scratch pad, Salinas says. But under continual stress, The scratch pad in the frontal lobe.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?